Welcome to Free Associations from the Boston University School of Public Health, the Public Health and Medical Journal Club podcast for anyone trying to figure out who or what to trust when it comes to health news. I'm Matt Fox, professor of epidemiology and global health, and I am here with Don Thea and Chris Gill from the Department of Global Health.
Hello. Hi.
Just waiting for them to say anything.
Anything.
What?
Anything.
And we are here, as always, broadcasting from the Boston University Godley Studio. Before we get started, we want to take a second to remind you about Population Health Exchange, the Boston University School of Public Health's resource hub for lifelong learning. Find out more at www.pophealthex.org, where you'll find this podcast, as well as many other population health learning programs and tools. And also a quick plug for the Population Health Exchange's Summer Institute, which is going on this summer. And you can go to Population Health Exchange's website to find out more information, but we've got courses in things like meta-analysis and SAS that you can go ahead and sign up for. So go ahead and take a look on the website. Those are the weeks of June 11th and June 18th.
For those who are not aware, SAS is a course you take when you're trying to talk back to your mom.
SAS.
Yeah.
Sassy.
Oh, jeez.
All right. Yeah.
Nick, cut that out.
How to do that? It's an essential public health school.
At this
moms have demanded it.
Just to be clear, can we fire the writers?
What version of SAS are we talking about?
Okay. And now on to the show. So today, in our first segment, which is our Journal Club segment, we are going to get into a study that looks at the changes in the human papillomavirus, known as HPV, in Scotland since the introduction of the vaccine, and whether or not we believe that that is causal. We do believe it's causal, but we want to find out how effective the vaccine is. In the second part of the podcast, which is our deep dive, we're going to look at we're going to talk about the objectives of peer review and what it is we're actually trying to do. Probably a conversation we should have had in episode 1, so we may have to go back and edit that in.
And then we just change the numbers?
Yeah, absolutely. We just mess it all around. Then in our third segment, which is our amazing and amusing, we'll get into some things that put smiles on our faces, or Chris will tell us how Facebook is making us all miserable. So let's get into our Journal Club segment, which is our segment 1. And here we're looking at an article that looks at changes in HPV prevalence over time. The article was published in Lancet Infectious Diseases, and it is titled Changes in the Prevalence of Human Papillomavirus Following a National Bivalent Human Papillomavirus Vaccination Program in Scotland, a 7-year cross-sectional study. That I didn't realize quite how long a title that is. Anyway, it's by lead author Kimberly Cavanaugh from the University of, and I can't pronounce this. Can any of you guys? Strathclyde?
Strathclyde, yeah.
Is that how it's pronounced? Strathclyde?
The Clyde is the river that runs through Glasgow.
Okay, so Strathclyde, Glasgow, which is in the UK. Now, let me give you some of the headlines on this one, and I will tell you there were not that many headlines on this one. We just felt this one was an important one to take on. But of course, did get picked up by the BBC because this one was done in Scotland, which says vaccine credited with HPV virus reduction in Scotland. And The Guardian said HPV rates dropped 64% in decades since recommended CDC vaccination. Sorry, I should have said that one was not specifically related to this study. That was a more general headline. Sorry, should have said that to start off with. But the first one was. The first one was based on this study. So Don, can you walk us through this study? Tell us what they did?
Sure, Matt. Let me give you a little bit of background because it may seem like this is not a very important kind of infection, but in fact it actually is. And we know that HPV is really a very, very important contributor to the development of cervical cancer in women. And I think CDC said that there were about 39,000 cases of cervical cancer per year in women in the United States, and about 31,000 of them are due to this particular virus, HPV virus. This virus has many strains, only a small portion of which actually are what we call oncogenic, which means that they cause cancer.
Yep.
And there have been a couple of vaccines, actually 3 vaccines that have been developed recently that are very effective in terms of preventing the acquisition of this particular virus. It in and of itself doesn't really produce any harm. It's really the subsequent development of cancer, most notably cervical cancer, but also anal cancer, and penile cancer are caused by infection with HPV. So cervical cancer is what this has been known for, and it's a really important morbidity and mortality both in the United States and across the world. But more recently, it's been noticed that there's been this marked increase in the development of head and neck cancer, primarily in men, and it is something that has been looked at recently, and not only is there a large increase in head and neck cancer in men, but that cancer is also associated with HPV. And it's something that therefore makes this particular disease really very important for both men and for women. So this particular study was a study that was really interesting because it was done in Scotland in a setting that really couldn't be done in many other places. Couldn't have been done in the United States, and could be done in Scotland, in part because there was a point in time, 2008, when Scotland decided that they were going to introduce one of these vaccines, this bivalent vaccine. It's a vaccine that's good against at protecting against two serotypes of HPV, serotypes 16 and 18, and those two are particularly oncogenic, but there are a few others, 31, 33, and 45, that are also less oncogenic but also can produce cancer. But this vaccine was directed only against those two strains. And what they did is they introduced this vaccine in all of the schools in 2008, and they were able to cover about 92% of the population of 12 and 13-year-old girls. And then they also did vaccinate what they call catch-up. So they vaccinated subsequently, fairly rapidly, girls between 13 and 18 years of age. And what they did is they then went back, or they waited until those girls who were vaccinated when they were 12 and 13 years old had their first obstetrical or gynecological exam, where they had their cervix swabbed looking for evidence of either precancer or cancer, and they would swab some of the fluid from the cervix, and they would then test it. And they looked for the presence of human papillomavirus in those samples. And because it was Scotland, and because they have a great data system there, they were able to actually hook up the results of that cervical test for the presence of this particular virus, and whether those women had, each one of those individual women had been immunized. And they basically asked the question: is there a relationship in terms of the infection rates in these cohorts over time and their prior immunization rate? And they were able to, as I said previously, immunize a huge portion of the population. So that really the takeaways from this study are that when they looked at the prevalence of this HPV virus in the cervixes of these women with each subsequent what we call birth cohort, so girls who were 12 and 13 in birth year 1998 and then birth year 1999, and they followed the prevalence of this infection in the samples from these girls over time, and there was a marked decrease. There was a 6-fold decrease in the prevalence of HPV in the cervixes of these girls over time, and this accounts for like 90% of the cancers, cervical cancers, found in Scotland. So they found that it was associated with the number of doses of the vaccine that the girls got. They found that there was no replacement of serotypes.
Meaning more doses, more effect.
Right. So the normal course is 3 doses, but it would be less effective in 2 doses, but still effective, and less effective in 1 dose, but still effective. They found that there was no evidence of replacement serotypes. So the ones that the vaccine was directed against weren't replaced by other types. And really interesting, they found that even though this vaccine is directed against 16 and 18, which is really the bad players in this scenario, it was also effective against those other several oncogenic serotypes. But the most interesting thing, I think, is that when they looked at the girls who were part of each one of those birth cohorts who remained unvaccinated, that the prevalence of HPV in those girls, so these girls had never been vaccinated, never seen this vaccine, the prevalence in those cohorts of HPV also went down, and that's what we call herd immunity. Because there was less of this HPV circulating in the population, those girls, even though they weren't directly vaccinated with this vaccine, were less likely to get exposed to the virus. So it's really a pretty, I think, remarkable study in that it shows that really on a population basis how effective the high penetration of a vaccine effort is in a population, and this will result in thousands of fewer cervical episodes of cervical cancer, penile cancer, rectal cancer, and head and neck cancer. So I think it's a landmark study.
It's really impressive. So one of the things that you either didn't say or I fell asleep for a bit was what the design was, that how they actually set this up, which is that this was not like many of the designs that we've looked at before where we have longitudinal data. This was, I think they call it a serial cross-sectional study. Mm-hmm. Cross-sectional, by which we mean we don't follow anyone over time. We collect data on two people at
birth cohort,
one point in time, and we compare the exposure and the outcome, and then we do it again in another group of people. So it's not the same people being followed over time.
Right.
It's different people.
But there was this sort of systematic point in time when this population of young girls who may or may not have been vaccinated with the HPV vaccine, depending on how old they were in 2008, by the time they reached the age of 20, all of them were being systematically sampled. And so there's the differential exposure to the vaccine.
Well, actually, 50% of them were being systematically sampled, and that was one of the weaknesses of the study.
Yeah,
we'll get into
that. We'll come back to that.
The point being that there's like a systematic point in time. So you're capturing all this data after variable length of exposure to the vaccine and penetration into the population.
Yeah. So one of the things that it took me a little bit to figure out here is the design, as you point out, was they were sort of taking advantage of a unique scenario, which is that previous studies had looked at this question, but had generally been looking at populations where the vaccinations were being done at older ages, and therefore many of the girls had already been exposed to HPV, and therefore the vaccine is not effective at that point. This was a case where the whole population is being targeted for vaccination at 12 to 13 years old, so you're getting them at a younger age, but you're also able to link the data together in a way that you really can't do in the United States because you have a health service being provided by a central government program, so you can link together the HPV diagnoses with the
national with
the vaccines. But further to that, the other thing I didn't realize was until later was all the people in the study, all the women in the study were roughly the same age. They were 20 to 21 years old, which is the age at which you would be recommended for your first
cervical
screening. So it's they're different birth cohorts, but they're all being captured at the exact same age of follow-up, which is why they
and elapsed time for vaccination.
Right.
I wasn't so clear on that. Is it the same?
Well, if they're all being vaccinated when they're 12 or 13 years old, and they're all getting their first gynecological exam when they're 20 years old, then it's pretty consistent.
It was my assumption, but I couldn't make it out perfectly. But anyway, so Chris, give us your take.
Yeah, so hugely important study. I totally agree with Don, and on I think there's a couple issues here that I thought we should emphasize. The first one Don had mentioned, which is that this is very strong proof of herd immunity, and while
can you say what herd immunity is?
So so when you're giving a vaccine to the population, you have direct benefits in terms of this individual has been vaccinated, they have generated an immune response, and that immune response protects them personally from getting this infection or this disease. But a second benefit of some vaccines, but not necessarily all vaccines, is that by vaccinating that individual, you also render that individual non-infectable or non-contagious, which means that they can be exposed to the pathogen, human papillomavirus in this case, but they can't acquire it and they can't transmit it. And so that means that the person who's next in that chain of exposures, which is a sexual chain, this is a sexually transmitted disease, would be at reduced risk, even if they personally had not received the vaccine. The fact that they're having sexual intercourse with someone who cannot transmit to them protects them indirectly. And so that indirect protection is what Don is referring to as herd immunity. So you vaccinate as one proportion of the population, and a larger proportion of the population also benefits from this.
And I think it's important to distinguish it from what the authors say is protection from other serotypes or cross protection, because this vaccine was directed against those two strains, 16 and 18, but those other 4 strains weren't part of the vaccine makeup, but they were close enough in their molecular makeup so that they were kind of innocent bystanders, if you will.
There was cross protection.
And one of the other things that was shown in this is that the cross protection for those other viruses didn't really wane over time, which I think was a really important point, because prior studies had shown that, in fact, that cross protection may exist, but it looks like it wanes over time. But that in retrospect to this study was because those other studies were methodologically flawed.
I think this is a very good example of where one could sort of like start with hypothesis and say, here's the way that they set up their study, where you've got this vaccination policy that begins at a discrete point in time, 2008. Prior to that, no one was getting the vaccine. After that, the vaccine was being systematically used and many people got the vaccine. But depending on their age, they may have received 0 doses, 1, 2, or 3 doses of vaccine. So they would have varying degrees of protection. And then we're going to follow them out. Those young women are growing older, and when they get to the age of 20 or 21, that's when the system starts to systematically sample them to see if they have HPV. And so if they were 19 years old in 2008, they would have received maybe 1, 2 or 3 doses, I suppose, or very likely no doses. And prior to 2008, everybody got no doses. And so you have this sort of dose response, experiment built into this, as well as what is the effect of age at vaccination in terms of its efficacy. And Dot already alluded to the fact that if this is a vaccine that we believe works by preventing the acquisition of HPV. It is not a therapeutic vaccine in that it is not designed to change the outcome of infection with HPV. It is designed to stop you getting it, full stop. But if you've already got the disease, the vaccine is not believed to have any benefit. And so if that's true, you can put all those factors together and say, well, what would you expect the data to look like? Right? You would say, okay, well, if you were on that older spectrum in 2008, you were 19 or 20 years old at the time, or you were, already, 20 years old in 2007, and so that you would not have got that. You would expect that you would be representing the baseline incidence of HPV in that population, and that as you move into younger and younger girls, who were 17, 16, 15, 14, 13, eventually 12 years old in 2008, that the impact of the vaccination would become bigger and bigger and bigger as you're getting higher proportions of the girls vaccinated and at an earlier age before they have started to have sex. Yep. So both of those being very important. And if that is true, you would anticipate that the indirect benefit would show some lag from the direct benefit. That those who got the vaccine are going to see a quick drop in the incidence of acquisition of HPV, and the indirect benefit is going to lag by several years because of that shape of the population. And with that, you could almost draw the graph in your mind to see what it would look like, and that is exactly the shape of the data that was observed in the study, which I think gives it so much face validity.
One thing that I can't remember, maybe you guys do. I can't remember whether they mentioned this, but part of the reason why they were so successful at getting such a high rate of vaccination is that the vaccination was done at school. So it was a captured population, and they got very high rates. They didn't say whether they vaccinated both boys and girls.
In this case, they was only girls.
Yeah. Only girls, which brings up a really interesting point, because we see this major effect and this major herd effect, despite the fact that it was only the girls that got vaccinated. So it would, presumably the majority of those of that chain of sexual transmission would be heterosexual, and we're seeing this big an effect, even though all of the boys that these girls are having sex with were themselves unvaccinated. So if you can imagine how much more efficacious this might be on a population basis in terms of the herd effect if you in fact vaccinate both the boys and the girls, which is really, I think, one of the take-home messages for this, because it's such an effective vaccine, and boys need to be protected almost as much as girls.
Sure. The advisory committee on immunization practices at the CDC recently changed its policy to include boys. I think it was around 2013 that they did that for that exact reason.
This is one of the best vaccines that has ever been created. Sorry, Matt.
No one wants to let me talk today.
Sorry.
That's fine. So I want to go back to something you said in the beginning, Don, which is you said there was a 6-fold reduction in the prevalence, right? Yeah, because this is cross-sectional prevalence, which I just want to make the point to people because we often talk about, it's important to not just talk about 6-fold, we want to talk about the actual values that we're talking about here. So unlike, the last podcast, we talked about heart attacks, which was a very rare event. It was less than I think it was like 1 in 1,000 or less than 1 in 100. I remember that. Here, we're talking about a very common event. So this was for the oncogenic subtypes, pre-vaccination, the prevalence was about 30%. So this is not an uncommon, and that 6-fold reduction leaves you at the end with 4.5%. So
huge
I mean, it's really important to understand that a 6-fold increase or a 6-fold reduction can mean a lot of different things. In this case, we are talking about massive public health benefit here that I think is important. Second thing I wanted to raise was this issue. So go back to the idea that this was a cross-sectional study or a serial cross-sectional study, the series of cross-sectional studies, really. Does it bother you all at all? I mean, we typically don't like to draw causal inferences from cross-sectional data because all kinds of things can go wrong when we deal with cross-sectional data. For one thing, you can have selection bias, right? It could be that those who are vaccinated and those who are most likely to get HPV don't end up in our sample and we miss them. You have, in some cases, the potential for reverse causality. So you get vaccinated because you're at you're at high risk for getting HPV. Does that raise any concern in this particular case?
This is a difficult question to answer because we don't know much about these girls. All we're really told in this paper is that there was a systematic policy to give the vaccine at a certain age group with a catch-up campaign, as Don was saying. And
yet we know not everyone was vaccinated,
right,
obviously.
There's never 100% who are going to be vaccinated. And then there was a systematic, touch point where they would see whether HPV infections had occurred.
Yep.
But beyond that, we don't know, how did they select some schools versus other schools, some girls versus other girls? We have no idea about that. But the size of this leads me to downplay that risk to some degree because it seems that it was much more systematic and much less we're doing this in one very, very high risk population. This really felt like they were just doing it in trying to get everybody in Scotland to do this.
Well, no, I agree with you in terms of the vaccination, but in terms of the those who ended up at potential risk for being included in this study, only they say in the discussion only 50% of those who would have been eligible actually get screened for cervical cancer or have a visit at which they would get
right.
screened. And therefore,
there?
that presumably is not a random 50%. It's probably associated with things like socioeconomic status. And
absolutely.
It could lead to some potential for, I think, selection bias or residual confounding, depending on how you define it.
But they did include a measure of socioeconomic status and put that into the analysis and did not find an association, even though it's people in that strata are at higher risk of acquisition.
Okay, so let me lay out another hypothesis. What if sexual behavior is changing over this time? What if over this time period they have also been implementing, sex education campaigns, and we know more about HPV, so we're trying to educate people to use condoms. Is that a possible explanation?
Absolutely, but the data that they provide here in their figure again argues a little bit against that because they looked at the prevalence, the proportion of young women at the age of 20 or 21 who were infected with HPV serotype 16, 18, 31, and 33. These are the oncogenic serotypes that Don was alluding to. But they also looked at all other serotypes of HPV.
For which there's no cross-reactivity.
For which there's no cross-reactivity, right? So which the vaccine could not help. Now, if we're assuming that this is selection bias and the young women who go to cervical cancer screening are systematically having less exposure, less sex, and not being exposed to HPV, we would expect that the decline in HPV serotypes would be true for all serotypes, whereas it is not true for all serotypes. Most of them stay constant. They're not affected by this, but the ones that are affected are uniquely the ones that are in the vaccine. So I think that largely negates that concern.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's strong evidence to suggest that that's not happening.
And in fact, I mean, as Chris says, I mean, there's a figure that gives the probability of being infected with any subtype, and then the subtypes that were not in the vaccine and were non-cross-reactive. Is that the right term?
Right,
Cross-reactive?
and those are flat over time.
And they're flat. But what's amazing to me is they're flat at around, 55%?
And common. So
I mean,
apparently these girls are having sex too.
This is a very common event. So I mean, I agree with you completely. I thought this was a place where you could probably even strengthen the argument with more negative control data. By which I mean, if you had some sexual behavior
like chlamydia data,
or you also had some other STI that you could show was staying really fairly flat over the time. It might strengthen the argument. But I agree with you. I'm not overly concerned. I mean. It's not the fact that it's cross-sectional doesn't bother me in the same way that it does. For one thing, we know the timing. We know that I suppose we don't necessarily know the timing. We know the timing of the vaccination. We don't necessarily know the timing of the infection.
Right.
Anyway,
I think there's actually a fairly important public health wrinkle that's introduced by these findings, and that is that at 20 years of age, girls come in.
Cool.
Girls come in for screening, and they don't come in for screening for HPV vaccine. They come in for screening for cervical dysplasia or precancer. And if this vaccine is going to be so highly effective at decreasing HPV and therefore decreasing the incidence or prevalence of precancer, then a positive screening test will become less valuable in this setting because the positive predictive value of the test will go down because the prevalence of the disease in the community is going to go down. So we're going to have to rethink our approach to cervical screening.
Yeah, I think what you're saying there needs a little bit of explanation, which is that people who are not familiar with how validation of medical tests work will often hear something like a test is 99% effective or valid, and tend to think, well, that's really good. 99%, that's really good. But the way that we think about how good a test is we have two measures, sensitivity and specificity. Sensitivity meaning of all the true positives, what proportion of them will test positive, and specificity of all the true negatives, what proportion will test negative. But that particular value, those two values mean nothing to me if I'm the one who gets the test. Because now I either have a positive test or a negative test. And what I care about now is the positive or negative predictive value, which is what you say, which is, if I test positive, what are the chances that it's positive?
That you truly are
that
positive.
I'm truly positive. And that's a function of both the sensitivity and specificity, but also of the prevalence. And the more rare something becomes, the more likely any positive is to be a true positive, even if it's a really good test. And so that's I hadn't really thought about this. Right? Sorry?
False positive.
What did I say?
You said true positive. Didn't you mean false positive?
Sorry, false positive. Yeah. False positive. And I think you're right. I mean, it's going to actually have to change the way that we potentially deal with screening for HPV if it becomes a rare event. Yeah. It's the same way that when I got married in the state of Massachusetts, I had to get a syphilis test for whatever reason that was required in the state of Massachusetts. And I went to my doctor and he said, just so you know, I'll give you the test, but if it comes back positive, we're not going to believe it anyway. I assume he didn't mean he was just going to ignore it, but his point was that it is such a rare event in the state of Massachusetts that if it were to come back positive, it's much more likely to be a false positive. Right. And I think that's something that people don't really appreciate outside of our world that I think is kind of important. Can I go back to one other issue, which is this issue of serotype replacement?
Yeah.
The idea that we sometimes are concerned that if we introduce a vaccine against a certain set of subtypes, for the whatever the ones here were for HPV, that's going to create fertile ground for other subtypes to take over, and maybe in the end we won't actually have done as much good as we think because these other ones will be pretty bad and they'll kind of just take over. And we said there was no evidence here for subtype replacement, and I generally agree with that. Although I am a little curious because I didn't totally get that message. So I was looking at Table 3, that's not for the listener, but that's for these guys, just to point it out. But in this table, they said they looked at the birth cohorts, and if you look at the serotypes that were in the vaccine, 16 and 8, you see these dramatic drops, protective effects for getting the vaccine. if you look at the 3 cross-reactive types, same thing. You see these massive benefits. When you look at the other types, you see increases. But if you go down in that table, when they actually looked not by birth cohort, but by number of doses, that's where you see really pretty much no benefit, no harm. So I didn't know exactly what to make of that. I mean, there's clearly some evidence of no serotype replacement. On the other hand, I wasn't sure what to make of the birth cohort issue.
I mean, the whole issue of serotype replacement, it kind of
Did I mess it up?
No, you got it right. It harks back to our experience with the pneumococcal conjugate vaccine. And so when, there was this vaccine introduced, which had initially 7 serotypes against this bacterium Streptococcus pneumoniae, they introduced the vaccine and they found that those 7 serotypes went down. But over time, a new serotype that had been previously quite rare started to occur at a higher rate. And so that is what they're concerned about here. But the biology behind the serotype changes with a bacterium versus a virus are quite different. And so with pneumococcus, for example, the serotyping is based on the polysaccharide capsules, these sort of gooey, gloppy, wet mucousy things that the bacteria lives inside and sort of secretes around itself to protect itself. The genes that code for different serotypes can switch very radically. And so there's an evolutionary pressure to, if you're being eliminated from your ecological niche because of this vaccine creating antibodies against you, to shift to a new serotype. The bacteria will and can and will do that. That is very different for viruses, where they're not shifting the expression of a gene. They're just different strains of the virus. And so the question becomes, is there like an ecological niche that they're competing for with finite resources, and there can't be 2 of the same in the same place? And I don't think that applies for viruses because they're so small. I mean, it's the theoretical concern behind this, but the biology behind these are totally different.
Yeah, and it may be, that what I'm really looking at is the birth cohort is simply the relative prevalence being greater for these subtypes. I just wasn't sure, and I just wanted to raise it as an issue. All right, anyone want the last word on this one? I think we all kind of agree that we're buying this story, even if there's potential for it to be slightly overstated. But really, the public health benefits are massive.
Well, two historical notes. The original theory that led to the discovery that HPV was the causal agent in most of cervical cancer started with a totally false interpretation of data, where it was noted that rates of cervical cancer were extremely low in Catholic nuns versus married women. And the theory then, by the doctor who noticed this, was that the women have their corsets tied too tight. So the data were correct. The interpretation of the data was insane.
Is that really true?
It is really true. And also totally sexist.
Yeah.
So
maybe it had something to do with communion wafers.
Something to do with that. As it turned out, I think it's because on average, the Catholic nuns are having less sex than married women. I think that's not a very controversial assumption. The second thing of historical interest is that, there's this wonderful book by Rebecca Skloot that came out a couple of years ago about the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks.
Yeah, amazing book.
Amazing book. And then she was the source of the tissue that led to these HeLa cells, Henrietta Lacks cells.
Say what HeLa cells, just for people who are listening.
Henrietta Lacks. This is a line of human cells that is used in tissue culture experiments. They grow forever and ever and ever. And they do that because they were derived from Henrietta Lacks's cervical cancer cells, which grew like wildfire and ultimately killed her in 1951. Yeah. She was infected with HPV serotype 18, which is one of the ones in this vaccine.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's move on to our second segment, in which we are going to talk about essentially what's the point of peer review, what is really the goal, and what's fair game when we critique a study. So let me give you the background for why I wanted to talk about this, which is that we did an episode in which we talked about the relationship between male circumcision and acquisition of HIV, as well as HIV treatment. And we put this out there, and there were a group of people who responded loudly. There were not many of them, but they responded loudly to let me know that they very much disagree with the science, that the scientific community nearly universally accepts that male circumcision is protective against HIV.
In other words, we got trolled.
That would be my interpretation. They pointed me to many critiques of those studies, of the original studies that looked at circumcision and HIV. And I listened to those podcasts and read the articles, and I felt like the articles, these critiques were disingenuous. I felt like they came in with an agenda seeking to negate the scientific evidence, and they were going to do that whether or not there actually was validity to the criticism.
So it was an a priori judgment on their part.
That would be my opinion. Now, to be fair to them, to be fair to them, they probably think the same thing of my approach to things. So I don't want to say that, but it got me to thinking. It was frustrating me that I felt like this approach that we use of fair game critiquing of studies was being used as a weapon, as opposed to being used as a means of being skeptical until we could really prove causation. Those studies, I think, were really quite solid, and yet every study has some limitations. So you could theoretically use that to rip apart any study. So my point here is I'm trying to figure out, what is peer review supposed to be doing? I'm going to assume that peer review is about trying to make science better, but is it the role of peer review then to say a particular study is complete garbage and shouldn't make it into the literature? Or is it simply the role of peer review to point out the flaws in the study and then to let it go forward once we know what the flaws are? So I'm trying to figure out what the line there is, and I wonder what you guys think about the role of peer review.
I don't think that there is any hard line in terms of those two approaches, and I think it's changing over time also. And I think that over the course of the last 20 years, depending on the discipline, there are different approaches. I mean, I think in the physics literature, papers are posted on the web very, very quickly, and then there is a very avid, very, very sort of animated discussion among presumably peers, but a very open and transparent discussion about the merits of that particular paper. And that's one way of doing it. The way that we're most used to peer review is that it's not a transparent process. The reviewers are not known to the authors, and the reviewers evaluate the strengths of the paper, determine whether it has a fatal flaw in terms of bias or conflict of interest or methodology, and they make a recommendation to the editor, who then brings it to the editorial board, and the editorial board will make a decision on whether to publish it based largely on the reviewer's comments. But I think that there's also a step where papers are not considered prior to it being sent out to peer review. Now, that could be because the paper just does not appeal to the readership of that particular journal, or it could be that it just falls so far below the mark in one respect or another that it's not considered to be worth even sending out for peer review. So I think that there's a bunch of different approaches out there, and I think it's dynamic. I think it's changing with time. Okay,
so you used the word fatal flaw. So I think we would all agree that if a paper has a fatal flaw such that really we think the results of the study are wrong, then it shouldn't be in the literature until it's either fixed, or if it can't be fixed, then it shouldn't be in the literature.
Right.
Is that it? Is that the bar? I mean, as long as you don't have a fatal flaw, we should say, something should go into the literature? Or what about, given that every study has errors, bias in them, systematic and random, is it really good enough to just say no fatal flaw?
Lack of fatal flaw.
What was that political thing that they had with the back in the Bush-Cheney era, where they had like total knowledge awareness or something, where they were trying to hoover up every piece of information that existed about everybody at all times in the interest of national security?
I thought that was the Obama administration did that.
I thought that was the Stasi in Germany.
Maybe all of the above. I don't remember my history well enough. Apparently,
where are you going with this?
I'm just saying, this is sort of getting to the point of there is no perfect study. There is no total knowledge awareness. Everything we're doing is a subset of something, and there's no perfect knowledge here. So we're all trying to just grope in the dark as best as we can and figure out what we're banging into with our shins and making sense of it.
Okay, so then what's your responsibility then as a peer reviewer?
Yeah, so the extreme case is that the paper is fatally flawed, and you're right. Ideally, the reviewer, the authors would then go back and fix that flaw and rerun the analyses and possibly completely change all their conclusions based on it. And if they do all of that, then they should probably be published. But that's like on one end of the spectrum. I think the more mundane is that the peer review process is sort of like essentially a quality control step in the science, where we're not really expecting to radically change the interpretation of these data, but what we're trying to do is to either seek greater clarification about things that were ambiguous or were poorly worded, or appeared that they have drawn conclusions illogically, or the data suggests something that they don't say, or there are limitations that they didn't note and they should be noted. And it is all, in a sense, designed to generate a better quality of science that is more valid. And so in a way, maybe the editorial board's like taking that first step by saying, here's a group of papers and here are some that we just think are not interesting or not valid, and we're not going to bother the peer reviewers. The peer reviewers then do mostly a QC step and occasionally an outright rejection. I mean, at least I was sort of curious about my own behavior in this. And I went back and looked at all the peer reviews I've done in the last 5 years.
All 4,000 of them?
There were a lot of them. I've done like 6 in the last 3 weeks.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I mean, so I'm like, they keep coming.
I think I've told you guys that one year a journal that shall remain nameless gave me an award for being their most prolific reviewers, and all that told me was I'm reviewing too many.
Exactly.
And I cut back.
You were feeling guilty before, now you're feeling like a sucker.
Exactly. I mean, it had the total opposite of the intended effect.
Yeah, I know. It's funny. So now I completely lost my train of thought.
Good.
But,
So while I've distracted you, then let me ask you this question. How much of the peer review process for you when you are a peer reviewer is you pointing out flaws in a manuscript that can't be fixed, right? They did their analysis wrong.
That would be a fatal flaw.
No, is it? I mean,
to me, yeah.
I'm not sure.
It can't be fixed, and it.
No, that implies that at the end of the peer review process, every study would be a perfect study. We can't fix all the problems.
No.
There are problems that can't be fixed.
Well, all right. I see what you mean.
So what I'm saying here is how much of that peer review process then is you pointing out flaws that cannot be fixed, them getting written into the limitation section, and the paper is really no better off other than to point out that it might have this flaw.
Expand their lack
and
of
is that
confidence.
enough?
I think that's
enough?
I think that's valid. I think
What's valid?
I think it's valid for the critique that we make about a flaw that cannot be fixed to be woven into the limitations
I'm not
of the
arguing
paper.
against that. I'm just saying, is that enough? Or what is the line between that and a fatal flaw is what I'm saying.
Well, a fatal flaw would fundamentally change the interpretation of the data and cannot be corrected.
And yet we often don't know how the interpretation would be different if many of the things we point out were wrong. Part of my point here is I think we have an obligation as peer reviewers to go beyond simply pointing out problems to speculating on the direction and the magnitude of those problems, which can be addressed quantitatively with quantitative bias analysis. I brought it up last podcast. I'll bring it up again. It can be done.
Are you going to explain what it is?
A way of
analyzing the amount of bias
of getting at the amount of error that a source of bias would have under plausible assumptions about the way that particular source of bias is acting. So it can be done, and we can ask as peer reviewers, we can ask the author of the study to go back and do those things. I don't think we do it all that much. But even we don't even have to quantify it so much as even if we just speculate, sometimes the biases that we come up with act in the opposite of the direction that we think they would if we just were to logic it out. And I think we have a responsibility to go beyond just pointing it out. So anyone want the last word on this one?
I don't disagree, but I remember what I was going to say, which is that I have very, very, very rarely voted in my reviews to outright reject a paper.
You don't vote people off the island.
I try not to do that. Mostly what I find I'm doing is trying to hang on to that paper and in some way compel the authors to improve it. Yeah. Rather than just letting it go.
Is an example of quantitative bias analysis the stuff that you did for the Apis paper?
Yes.
Or the no-shots paper.
It was the no-shots paper where we had a particular study.
I think it would be interesting to actually go through that for the listeners at some point. Not now, maybe, but
for the listeners, we have been toying with this idea for a long time now of doing one of our own studies as a podcast episode so that we could point out the fact that our studies have problems too. And in this one particular one, we had some errors that were raised
Not
by the
fixable.
They were not fixable, but they were quantifiable, and we
Right.
quantified them. And in doing so, we're able to demonstrate that the impacts were minimal and often in the opposite of the direction that you might expect, and that's really important information. So we will come back to that at some point, but not in this episode, because now we got to get on to the amazing and amusing. Here, where we want to look at some of the things that make us enjoy our jobs even more than we already do, or look at the weird and wacky things that happen in our field, or those that inspire us. Chris, I'm going to ask you to go first, and I will be setting a timer this time to make sure you don't go over your allotted. What is it
3
get?
minutes?
3 minutes.
32 seconds.
Ready?
Go.
Go.
All right. So this is a paper that I found in the British Medical Journal yesterday, published in 2018. So it's hot off the press. This is Diana Quirmbach, Quirmbach, and colleagues. And it's an economic analysis looking at the effect of increasing the price of sugar-sweetened beverages on alcoholic beverage purchases.
Yeah, this one made the rounds.
Yeah, this is an interesting one.
Yeah.
And so, like for the background here is that there's a lot of interest in taxing sugar-sweetened drinks, so that you make them expensive, and then the people will drink less, Coke, basically, or sugary drinks. And what they were asking is like, well, is there a side impact of doing this? Like, so they're not you increase the tax on sugary sodas, but what do they do instead? Very good question. And they did a whole series of interesting economic analyses around this, and basically found that, obviously the question is quite subtle, and it depends on whether you're taxing very sugary drinks or somewhat sugary drinks or diet drinks, which don't have a lot of sugar in them. And it also depends on the income of the people who are being taxed, because that changes their, if you have tons and tons and tons of money, you may not care about the impact of the tax. But generally what happened in this cohort, which is all self-reported, so this is sort of modeling data, is that if you heavily tax highly sugary beverages, this is data from the United Kingdom, they seem to respond by drinking more beer.
This is such a fascinating.
I think that would be probably a common denominator for a whole lot of substitution behavior.
It's such a fascinating example of the law of unintended consequences.
Absolutely is. And to quantify that, in this analysis here, they had a drop in, with a tax, it would reduce consumption of sugary beverages by around 0.7%. So it's not a huge difference. But the increase in alcoholic consumption of beer, lager, cider, or wine was plus 1.57%. So it not only exceeded, not only moved them, but it vastly exceeded their consumption of sugary beverages, just shifting to alcoholic beverages. And I just thought that was like you say, the first law of public health is that no good deed will ever go unpunished.
Oh boy! What Francois Fenter, one of our colleagues from South Africa, always says that public health is the art and science of making people feel bad about what they eat and what they eat and having sex, and I forget. It's one of those things of we just go after one thing and another thing just comes right back. Right.
Well, I have actually a companion piece for Christmas.
All right, go for it.
Wow.
So I have a piece that was published in the Journal of Forensic and Legal Medicine. When was this? This was in 2008. First author is Stephen Bolliger. And this is information that will come in handy for your next beer brawl.
Beer brawl?
Beer brawl.
What exactly is a beer brawl?
Beer fight.
Can you define
beer
that?
Fight.
A beer fight.
Yeah,
What is that?
That's when you get into a fight in a bar.
Oh, okay. So it's not a fight over what kind of beer we're going to drink.
Well, it could be,
like
depending.
We did in college.
There are beer brawls, bar brawls for a whole lot of the
I
different
have
things.
not had a bar brawl in a very long time.
When was your last? Okay. Anyway, moving on.
So, in any event, the question that they asked, which they thought had particular relevance, because this is England also, and apparently there are a lot of bar brawls and beer brawls in England because of hooliganism and all the rest of that stuff, was that
It's very popular.
They asked the question: what is more harmful, being hit over the head with an empty bottle of beer or a full bottle of beer? So they went through this very systematic
I feel like I read this study.
evaluation of the force required to break a beer bottle, whether it's full or whether it's empty. and they did a very systematic series of experiments where they dropped a steel ball onto a series of full beer bottles and empty beer bottles. Here's a picture of the beer bottle that they used. It was
A standardized beer bottle?
standardized beer bottle from Feldschlossen Brewery in Rheinfelden, Switzerland.
Okay.
And what do you guys think would be a bottle that would have a higher tendency to break at a higher energy level or with more force? Empty or a full bottle of beer?
Full, because liquid is non-compressible, so it would push back harder.
I was going to go empty. I don't know why.
I don't know. What's the answer?
But I have no logic behind
So
that.
apparently,
I've only ever been hit by full bottles, so
it
what do I know?
requires a fair amount of force, and they calculated the force in relation to the force for crushing a cranium, which had been previously determined on a series of cadaver heads.
Okay, yeah.
But
Somebody
it turns
had to
out
do that research.
turns out Chris is right that the beer bottle that was full required 30 joules of impact energy, as opposed to the empty bottles, which required 40 joules of impact energy. And that was in part because it's full and beer is not compressible, but also because it's carbonated and it's pushing out with
so it explodes.
with a greater force.
Oh, so I got it backwards.
No,
you got it right.
Bottle
It'll
breaks
break.
more
it'll
easily.
break. It breaks
Yeah.
more easily.
Oh, but I was thinking it would break less easily.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
Oh, all right.
Yeah,
so Matt was right.
Okay. Matt's
So I was right.
Good job, Matt.
Well,
So,
I've had
so
my
you just
share
know
of...
this is
the
your
trouble-
misspent youth, showing that all those years were well spent.
Do you want to see the dents in my cranium?
But the trouble is that a full beer bottle has
trouble.
more mass and more force when it hits your cranium, so it will
that's bad.
probably do more damage.
Yeah.
All right.
Wow.
Well,
wow, that
things
is
that they don't teach you in school, right
helpful
there.
to know too.
And
That
it takes
really is.
apparently
Would
it
you-
takes
So if you're about to be hit by someone who's
like,
got
wait,
a beer
is
bottle,
that
wait,
full?
can you empty that first?
right.
Got it.
And
Got
apparently
it.
it takes somewhere between 14.1 and 68.5 joules of impact energy to crush your cranium.
How many?
Okay. That is a weird...
14.1 to 68.1.
It's
Wow. So you're going to
Depending
break
on
their
where
head
on
when
your
you hit
cranium.
them.
Yeah, no, that's the whole point.
Wow. So it's like deadly.
Yeah.
It's weird to me that is a known quantity to begin with. That anyone went through and tried to figure that out. But anyway.
Wow. That is
All right.
serious science.
Yeah.
All right. So mine is a brief one. Mine is just a tweet this time. So as you know, remember that we talked about p-values. About significance testing.
No, I don't remember that.
A couple of podcasts ago, and in it, I showed you that list that professor from the UK, Matthew Hankins, had on ways that euphemisms that people use for getting close to
Yes, that was
significance.
great.
That really long
I
list.
love that.
Yeah.
So this is an additional one that was tweeted out by a guy named Noah Motion. who's-
Additional list of...
No. Just an additional comment on the people using the approaching significance. He tweets at @stadmodcitizen, and his tweet says, "Statistical test results do not approach in quotes, do not approach significance, nor do they flee from it, sneak up on it, skirt around it, loiter next to it, pass by it unknowingly, gaze at it longingly from afar, or plan expeditions to find it in remote mountain ranges." And then there were a couple of good additional responses people had. Have they ever made highly inappropriate suggestions to significance? The result innocently flirted with significance but failed to seal the deal. The p-value holidayed in significance once but does not live there. The outcome met significance in 2011 on a package cruise for about 6 minutes. And my favorite one, the p-value swiped left on significance.
Oh, good one.
So those made me happy.
Oh,
All
yes,
right.
indeed. That's brilliant.
So that is the end of our program. If you've got any feedback on this or any other episode, or you want to suggest a topic for us to take
yourself.
on, keep it to yourself, says Don. But otherwise, you can tweet at us at @PopHealthyX, or you can tweet me at @ProfMattFox, or Chris at @IDDocGill,
Preferably late at night.
or Don at @DTheo1. Or you can find us at the Population Health Exchange website at www.pophealthyx.org. We want to thank Leslie Talalian, Director of Lifelong Learning at BU School of Public Health, for supporting the podcast, and Nick Guler for sound and editing, of which we seem to have more and more every episode. Thanks for joining us. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you will download our next episode.